Dear members, I am very happy to introduce Dr. Thambu David, Professor and Head of Medicine at the Christian Medical College, Vellore. He is also the Director for the Cochrane Center for Systematic Review on Meta-Analysis. He has been conducting the postgraduate research methodology courses in CMC for many years. And his interest has been training the people in diagnostic tests and other epidemiological methods. And he has been helping our department for many years in understanding the concept of diagnostic test. Therefore, I requested him to do this lecture for Indian Society for Medical Statistics members as well as the IndiaClan members. That he is a good teacher and he is a great researcher. I have been working with him very closely for many years. Now, I am sure you would enjoy his lectures. Please ask your questions at the end of the lecture. He will give you some time to raise questions. So he is going to take 4 lectures for us, and I'm sure it will be useful for your research and career development. Thank you very much. Thanks, Thambu.
Thank you very much, sir. It is a great honor to be invited by your teacher to take class. Dr. J. Seelan is my teacher, and I'm very honored that he has asked me to take this session. I was listening to the lectures by Dr. Shrikant Bangdiwala. He's one of the foremost researchers in the world. So I feel humbled that I am part of the same lecture series. I would ask you all to ask as many questions as you like at the end of the session. I'll start off slowly with some very basic concepts, and I will go a little bit more advanced towards the end of the talk. So the initial slides will be basic concepts. After that, we'll go a little bit more in detail. Today, I'm going to talk about research questions in general, not only about diagnostic. I'm also going to talk about study designs, not only diagnostic. And then I'm going to go on from this will take about 15 minutes. But the second part of the lecture, an hour, will be about phases of diagnostics tests and diagnostic tests as part of the clinical pathway. So this is a little bit about my institution, Christian Medical College. We are located in South India and Vellore. And this is our web page if anybody is interested in coming. This is our founder, Dr. Ida Scudder, and we are about 120 years old. This is where we spent many years together, the clinical epidemiology unit. This is the entrance to the hospital campus. And in the hospital campus, there's a building called the Asha building. And in the basement of this building is a clinical epidemiology unit. We also have a project called the B.V. Moses Center, where we do systematic reviews. That's a little bit about my center. So we're moving on. The modern practice of medicine, now with COVID, evidence-based medicine is, everybody talks about evidence-based medicine. It is not a rocket science. We take our clinical experience, the best research evidence, and the patient values, what the patient wants. And the marriage of these three is called evidence-based medicine. So in effect, it is actually good medicine. So what are the stages of one doing research? If one wants to do research, you must always start with a question. Does this drug work for this condition? Once you decide on a question, you must choose the appropriate study design. Once you have chosen a study design, you must have a plan. How can I go about doing this research plan? Once these 3 steps are over, you must do the study, collect the data. The next step is to analyze the data. Finally, you must interpret the results. What do these results mean? And finally, publish your study. So these are the stages in which one can find oneself doing research. So in the modern era, what does a researcher need to be good at doing? Of course, one must be good at the questions which I mentioned earlier. And there is a paper which you can read at leisure later on. It's in the American Journal of Epidemiology, a recent publication, where they mentioned 5 things that a modern researcher must be good at. First, you must know all about study conduct. You must know all about methodologies of studies. You must be good in that. Many people are good in theory, but they're not able to plan out well. So planning requires thought, how will I go about doing the study? Finally, conducting the study and analyzing the study requires another skill set. The next one is communicating and making sure your research is translated into actual practice. That also requires a separate skill set. And lastly, some people are good coordinators and leaders of research. They can make sure everything happens well. They lead a team well. So the reason I'm mentioning this is these are modern areas a researcher needs to be good at. And if you want your career in research to be good, you should be good in each of these aspects, not just in one particular aspect of doing research. So I started off by saying you need to ask a question. So the questions in research can be background questions or foreground questions. By background questions, I mean, is there COVID in India? How much hypertension is there? How much diabetes is there? Those are general questions. So general research question is also called a background question. Foreground questions or more focused questions, some people call them focus questions, have the format of what is called PICO: the patient, the intervention, the comparison, and the outcome, PICO. And I'm going to talk more about the PICO in the next few slides. So let's look at these questions. Is zinc effective in treating cold? Zinc is an intervention, and cold treating effective in treating cold is the outcome. Now, this is a broad question. Should I use zinc for cold? But I can also make this question a little bit more expanded. In children with common cold, is oral zinc effective in reducing the duration of symptoms as compared to placebo? Here, this question has a P, or the patient, children with common cold. The question above doesn't talk about the patient group. Oral zinc is a little bit more specific than just zinc. This has no comparison group. Here, we're talking about a comparison or a placebo group. The outcome here just says effective. Here it says effective in reducing duration of symptoms. So the question also specifies the outcome. Plus in the bottom, you can see it says RCT. So this particular question is going to be answered by a randomized control study. What about a question of etiology? Is smoking a risk factor for tuberculosis? Smoking is the exposure and the outcome is tuberculosis. One can again make this into a PICO kind of question. Are people who smoke regularly at greater risk for developing pulmonary tuberculosis as compared to those who do not smoke? Here you got P are the people who smoke regularly. That's the patient group. The intervention or exposure, both are the same. Here is smoking. The comparison is those who don't smoke. And the outcome is incidence of pulmonary tuberculosis. You can specify, I want to do a cohort study or I want to do case control study. One more example. Can polymerase chain reaction detect TB? This is one way of asking a question. If I want to make it into a PICO format, adults with suspected pulmonary tuberculosis, is PCR more sensitive and specific than culture? The P here, or the patient group, are adults with suspected pulmonary tuberculosis. That's a patient group. The intervention or the new test is PCR. The comparison is the culture. And the outcome of a diagnostic test in the PICO format is sensitivity and specificity likelihood ratio. So this is how one converts a question into a PICO question. Now, where does this fit in the universe of research? Now, we always start off with a research question. I hope you can see my cursor. The research question leads you to a study design. And the study design and research question will lead you to a research plan. Now we will implement the research and do the actual study, actual subjects, actual measurements, and we'll come to some conclusion or the findings. These findings will be inferred back to the population at large. The truth of the study, whatever we found, it may be true, it may not be true. If our methods are not done properly, we may not get much truth. But the studied truth is then reflected back to the whole population in which we are living. Let us say this is the population of India. The target population is the people of India. We do a sampling of them and we do a research on the sample and we go back and infer it back to the universe or the whole population. This part is called internal validity. The study itself, how well was the study done? External validity refers to, do the results of this particular study, do they reflect back to the entire population in which, so your analysis is done here, but we're trying to interpret the results in light of the entire population. Some people classify research as laboratory research, clinical research, and population research. Population research, if it involves large populations. Clinical research, I suppose, could involve like hospital-based research. And laboratory research is just research involving just lab samples. There is always an overlap between these groups. Now going on a little bit more about research questions. You have a question in mind and somebody may ask, should I really pursue this research? So one mnemonic which is helpful is called FINER. F stands for feasible. Is your research question feasible? Do you have enough subjects? Do you have technical expertise? Do you have time and money? And is it manageable in the scope of the time or the overall idea? I stands for interesting. Is the question interesting? Does it intrigue you or your friends? Novel. Is it something new? Will the research come to some new findings or are you copying somebody else's findings? E, ethical. It has to be something with your ethical committee or institutional review board will approve. R is finally relevant. Is it relevant to the current situation you are located in, to the scientific knowledge already available? So these are called FINER criteria, which help you to decide whether I must actually pursue and take this question on to finally doing a research project. So I'm listed different types of research question here. And these research questions are all about COVID, but asked in different ways. Do healthcare workers have anxiety? What happens to patients with COVID? Who are the healthcare workers at risk for COVID? How do you prevent healthcare workers getting COVID? How do you diagnose COVID? What are the problems healthcare workers face while taking care of COVID? What are the costs of COVID? So the same question about COVID can be asked in different ways. Now, you are all an advanced statistical group. You know all about different study designs. They can be qualitative or quantitative. Quantitative could be interventional, like randomized studies, which Dr. Kant has taken last week, or observational studies, which could be case control, cross-sectional, cohort, case series, or mixed designs, which have qualitative and quantitative. Now, these questions can be asked by all these kind of study designs. Let us try to mix and match them. Do healthcare workers have anxiety about COVID? Now, this question is answered by a cross-sectional study. And this is one example which I put up on the screen, prevalence of anxiety among COVID healthcare workers. Cross-sectional studies are a one-point-in-time study. They are a snapshot. Patients with and without disease, you can find out prevalence. And you can also compare the exposure among people with and without disease. Here, overall, the prevalence of anxiety was 12%. Those with positive COVID cases, healthcare workers who were taken care of a COVID patient had higher anxiety. So this is a cross-sectional example. People with disease, people without disease, and you compare the prevalence in the two groups. The PICO question for a cross-sectional study, P are the healthcare workers. The outcome is prevalence of anxiety. You can compare those who, I could be those who looked after actual COVID patients, and C could be those healthcare workers who actually didn't take care of COVID patients. The next question is, what happens to patients with COVID? So this is obviously a cohort study. You have to follow up a group of patients and see what happens to them. In cohort study, you start off with a group of patients who have something in common. They're followed up for a length of time. Some of them have a risk factor and some don't. Some develop the disease and some don't. So for example, you have a patient with COVID, some have diabetes, some don't have diabetes, and you follow up to see which of them die and which of them are left alive. An example is this particular COVID study, a cohort study, which is looking at mortality in COVID patients. They had 179 COVID patients, 21 of them who died. And they finally found that people who are older died more. People with cardiovascular diseases died more. And they also found out predictors that people with who would die of pneumonia and who wouldn't die of pneumonia. So this is a cohort study. The PICO question for a cohort, patients with COVID pneumonia, the intervention or exposure is diabetes. The comparison is no diabetes and outcome is mortality. Who are the healthcare workers at risk for COVID? So this is a publication from the Indian Journal of Medical Research, including the ICMR Director General. So they did a case control study. So case control studies are easy. You first identify cases. Then you identify those without disease, or are called controls. You ask for history of exposure and the study is over. So the cases are doctors who developed COVID. Controls are doctors who didn't develop COVID. The exposure is chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine. That's all. The study is done. So how do the results get presented? Cases are those with COVID. Controls are those without COVID. Here are those who took chloroquine prophylaxis, yes and no. And you have a table and you can present the odds ratios. So this is a simple way of presenting a case control study. How do you write a PICO statement for a case control study? P are the healthcare workers. I are those at risk, for example, obese. C is the controls, could be those without obesity. And O is the risk of getting COVID. Another way of asking the same question, how do you prevent healthcare workers from getting COVID? And this is a randomized control study which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. How do you do a randomized control study? Well, Dr. Kant has taken a great deal of classes for you on that. You select a group of people at risk for COVID. You randomize them. One group gets chloroquine, one does not get chloroquine, and you follow up and see how many develop COVID. So this is the same consort study figure, which you all are familiar with. So what did the study find? They randomized 400 people to get chloroquine. 400 people were on placebo. Confirmed or probable COVID-19 happened in 11% of those on chloroquine versus 14% of those on placebo. Though it appeared different, the p-value was not significant. How do you write a PICO for a randomized control study? It's very much like a cohort study. P are the healthcare workers. The intervention is chloroquine. The control is no chloroquine. And the outcome is incidence of developing COVID. How do you diagnose somebody with COVID? This is a diagnostic study which was published in this particular journal. So how do you do a diagnostic study? Well, today's talk is all going to be about the anatomy of diagnostic study. So I won't dwell too much on this slide. Obviously, you must have a group of people with suspected disease. Then you must have a good test, which is also called the gold standard or the reference standard. And the gold standard could be positive or the gold standard could be negative. So people with suspected disease are put through a gold standard test. Those who are positive are called positive. Those who are negative are called negative. Then we must do the new test on all these people. The new test could be positive or the new test could be negative. And we have a 2 by 2 table. Those who are positive by both are called true positive. Those who are negative by both are called true negative. People who are positive by the new test but negative by the gold standard are called false positive. Those who are negative by the new test but positive by the gold standard are called false negative. I'll talk about this in a more detail in a little while. At the end of a diagnostic study, like the example I gave, we will come up with answers called sensitivity and specificity. And we'll talk about that in the subsequent class. Sensitivity in this particular study was 93% and specificity was 99%. But they gave some caveats. How do you write a PICO statement for a diagnostic study? P are those with suspected disease. The intervention is your new test, antibody. The control is your gold standard test or reference standard. And outcome is sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value. Now you can write some caveats that the test was very good, but only after 2 weeks. For the first 2 weeks, this test didn't work so well. So we may not actually be able to use antibody tests for COVID. Now, there are so many types of questions, but I'm going to stop with this particular last one. What are the problems healthcare workers face while taking care of COVID patients? So they asked a group of nurses, what kind of problems do you face? So these are called qualitative studies, where you're trying to understand people. There's no hypothesis. There's no sample size. You're trying to develop a hypothesis. The kind of studies which are included in qualitative studies are in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, questionnaires, living with people with the condition, analyzing the radio or TV to understand what's going on. So this is a particular qualitative study. It was conducted on nurses. They did 20 in-depth interviews with nurses to ask them, what did you feel about looking after COVID patients? And finally, they came up with 3 or 4 different ideas. One are negative emotions. The second one was, how did they cope with it? The third was, some of the nurses felt they grew under pressure. And the fourth idea was they had some positive emotions about looking after COVID. How do you present data in qualitative studies? Data are usually presented as quotations. So-and-so said this, and this suggests negative emotions. Or this other patient said this, and that suggests how they are growing under pressure. So these are qualitative studies. So I'll end this brief first section with a recap. We looked at research always begins with a question. The question must be made into a PICO format so that it becomes from a broad question to a narrow question. Once you've made your PICO question, you must choose your study design and write your PICO question according to that study design. This is the phase 1 before we start into research. Now we are going to go in depth about diagnostic studies. So diagnostic studies are used to differentiate normal people from abnormal. Now, very many people have a problem with that. what is normal and what is abnormal. That's probably a discussion for another day, but that's an important question which one must consider. Diagnostic studies can be used in a variety of situations. You can check one's predisposition to a disease. You can screen people for disease. You can use it to diagnose somebody who comes to you with a particular problem. You can use it to stage that stage of disease. You can use it to prognosticate. You can use it to stratify people into various levels. You can use diagnostic tests to look at response to treatment. You can use it to monitor treatment or even surveillance. So diagnostic studies can be used in a variety of situations. Now let's tell a story. Somebody comes to me as a physician with cough or fever, cannot smell, suddenly smell is gone, and they consult me. I'll take a detailed history and examine them. As a doctor, I will make a list of the likely diagnosis, and I may or may not order further tests. Now, when the patient came to me at the initial stage of diagnosis, I may make a spot diagnosis. I may say that, oh, during the time of COVID, somebody come with cough and fever and lack of smell. That is COVID. I may not do any more tests. Self-labeling is when the patient themselves come to you and say, doctor, I think I have COVID based on my presenting complaints. Or some pattern recognition. Oh, fever and loss of smell is always COVID during a pandemic. Then you try to refine your diagnosis a bit further. You try to rule out some tests. Maybe I'll just do a COVID antibody test first. If that's negative, then oh, there's something else going on. So a stepwise refinement occurs. Then we do some reasoning by probabilities, and we'll talk about likelihood ratio and probabilistic reasoning little later. Again, we come back to pattern recognition. This symptom and this sign, these are the most likely patterns that fit this diagnosis. Something similar are clinical prediction rules. If the initial bunch of tests, your clinical features and your initial tests don't help you, then you must go to making a final diagnosis. Further tests need to be ordered. Interpretation of these tests, the tests take time to occur, and you finally need to label somebody as having a disease or no disease. So why are diagnostic tests so important? Can we make mistakes while making diagnosis? Yes. This particular article, which is published in the JAMA, many errors in hospitals are made because of wrong diagnosis. As surprising as that may seem, many people do make wrong diagnosis. And preventing deaths is an important area, preventable deaths. 30% of preventable deaths in hospital are because of wrong clinical diagnosis. So it's very important to look at diagnosis because a wrong diagnosis can also make harm to the patient, including death. So let me give you some examples of where all diagnostic tests could be used. For example, screening. Now in the West, everybody after the age of 50 has a colonoscopy every 3 to 5 years to look for CA colon. That's screening. Risk assessment. Now, very many people come and say, let's do a cholesterol test. Why do you want to check your cholesterol? You don't have any symptoms. No, based on my cholesterol level, I look at my risk of getting heart disease. Now, somebody comes to you with a big swelling in the neck and you do a biopsy, that is a diagnosis for a condition. Next is to rule out disease. Somebody is coming with knee joint swelling. You're worried whether there's infection in the knee joint. So you put a needle and you remove some fluid and look for infection. Triage. Now, suppose somebody comes to you with vomiting of blood. One way is to just say you have probably got ulcer in the stomach. So I'll just treat you for ulcer. The second way is to say, look, maybe you have got cancer. So let me do an upper GI scopy first. So this is called triage. The first test is to make sure that there may be something else or not. That will lead to further testing. That kind of testing is called triage. Monitoring therapy. Suppose you have blood cancer. The doctor will tell you, please come and do the blood cell counts every month. Why? We're not diagnosing blood cancer, we already diagnosed. But because we are giving some chemotherapy, the white blood cell count may come down. So that is called treatment monitoring. Then there's grading and staging of disease. The swelling in the neck biopsy came back as lymphoma, a kind of blood cancer. We may still after that do a CT scan to see how very extensively this particular disease has spread. That's called grading or staging. The last thing is prognosis. We know that certain blood tests will tell you we're not diagnosing based on the blood test, but those tests are used to determine prognosis. Oh, if this chemical is high in your body, you're not likely to do well, whatever the grading or staging of disease. So why are you doing diagnostic tests? The most important thing is the context in which you are doing it. When you're reading a journal article to change your practice, or if somebody comes to you as a statistician, what is the context in which you're trying to do the research? Or if somebody has already done one and you're trying to read it for a journal club, is that context in which that person did the study similar to my context? So to summarize this section of diagnostic tests, we have an existing test which is often used, and the test could be positive or negative. Sometimes tests are used to replace the existing test. So here the new test is done instead of the existing test. So you may say, okay, I'm not going to do an angiogram anymore. I'm going to do a CT angiogram. A triage test comes before the existing test. So you can see there's a population, the new test. If the triage test is positive only, they'll do a existing test. Sometimes a new test is an add-on. So your new test is not coming before or along with, it is an add-on. So you have the population of interest, you have an initial test, then you have a screening test, which is like this, but only those who are negative by the screening test, the new test is done. All those who are positive by the existing test, they are taken as having disease. So here this is new test is called an add-on test. So this is another way in which diagnostic tests come in the care pathway. Let's look at some examples to make it easy. Now, previously for tuberculosis, everybody did culture by Lowenstein-Jensen method. A replacement is now the PCR test. If PCR is positive, it's taken as having a TB. So in this situation, the PCR test has mostly replaced the culture method. Triage. So some people come with suspected cervical cancer. So previously the gold standard is you'll biopsy immediately. But nowadays people do a pap smear and look at that. If the pap smear is positive, then you do the biopsy. Pap smear is negative, maybe you can wait for some time. So the pap smear has come before the biopsy as a sort of triage. A replacement. Now in many hospitals, mammogram is done to look for cancer of breast. But in most hospitals now, they start doing MRI of the breast because it's far easier to do, less radiation. The MRI may be a replacement test for the mammogram. Add-on test. Now we suspect lung cancer in somebody who smokes, then you may do a CT scan. But after a month, the patient says, doctor, I'm not very comfortable. I still have a worry that I missed something. Then you can say, I'll do a PET scan or a PET CT scan. This is an advancement which we are doing over the current test. Finally, there's something called parallel and combined test. A combined test is you do one test first. If the test is positive, you call them having disease. If the first test is negative, then you repeat another test on the negative test. And if they're negative on both tests, then you can say the person doesn't have disease. This is called combined test. Parallel test is both tests are done simultaneously. So very often what you think is combined may actually end up being parallel test. Now, suppose you have a bright idea and you say that this new test of mine is going to diagnose deep vein thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the leg. That's the initial stage or a technical phase. You set up a lab and you try to make a new test. The next stage, again the technical stage, you take cases with already proven deep vein thrombosis and you take a group of people without deep vein thrombosis and you see if your new test is actually able to distinguish people with disease from people without disease. The next stage is you don't take people with proven disease. You wait in your emergency department and anybody who the doctor suspects as having deep vein thrombosis, in them you must do the new test. And you must have at that time a gold standard test to compare it with. And you see how well your new test worked against the gold standard test for that particular disease. And finally, you must know that, does my new test make any difference to a patient's life? Is he better? Is he back to work? Has the family gone broke? We don't know. So these are other questions that one must ask. This new test, did it really help my patient? So this, does it help my patient, is called a randomized control study in a diagnostic method. So you're using a randomized control study in diagnostic methodology. This is not new. It is increasingly popular, but it's new concept to many people. How does it work? You have people with suspected disease. You're randomizing them to get either a D-dimer test or a physician's judgment. Those who are D-dimer test done, if D-dimer is negative, you tell them you don't have a CT scan, go home. Whereas if D-dimer is positive, then you'll do a CT scan. People randomized to physician's judgment are only going to get no CT or CT. So you have to compare. The outcome here is not how many were positive, how many were negative, but rather how long will the patient survive. If the survival rates are same in both arms, then both strategies, the D-dimer strategy as well as the physician's based assessment, are both same. So one particular example, somebody compared two gauges of needles for biopsy. They were randomly assigning patients to get a 22 gauge needle biopsy or a 25 gauge renal biopsy. At the end of it, they found that the reference standard for the final diagnosis of surgery or follow-up if the tumor was unresectable. So the outcome has to be a clinical outcome. So as I told you in the previous slide, the outcome is not sensitivity or specificity, the randomized diagnostic study, but the outcome is sensitivity and is survival. So that's an important concept in RCT of diagnostic studies. The outcome is actually a clinical outcome. So again, going back to the slide, you have two arms. One group gets a 25 gauge needle biopsy. Other group gets a 22 gauge needle biopsy. And you follow up the patient and sees what happened and look for survival of patients in both arms. So now let's move on to a basic diagnostic study. Little bit more detail about a basic diagnostic study. In a basic diagnostic study, you have a series of patients with suspected disease. Everybody has index test. By index test, I mean the new test. Everybody has a reference standard after that. By reference standard, I mean the gold standard test. At the end of it, you make a 2x2 table. This is a basic study design of a diagnostic study. I'll expand that a little bit. So you have a group of people who have a particular problem, let's say suspected COVID patients in the whole of Tamil Nadu state. Or it could be any place. And from that, you take a study sample. You don't take everybody in the population, you take a study sample. The index test is your new test. The new test could be positive or the new test could be negative. Then everybody here has the gold standard test. the reference standard test. Based on the gold standard test, you could be positive or negative. Now, among those who were index test positive, whose gold standard tests were positive are called true positive. Among those in the reference standard, when the reference standard was negative, but the index test was positive, are called false positive. Among those who were reference standard positive, but the index test was negative, those people are called false negative. And among those in the gold standard who were negative, but the index test was positive, was negative also, those are called true negative. So this is how one makes out a 2x2 table. And based on this, we calculate sensitivity and specificity. Now, some people just don't like PICO. They like to say PIRT format for diagnostic study. P then stands still for the patient. I stands for the reference index test or the new test. R stands for the reference standard or the gold standard. And T talks about the target condition. For whatever reason, both are almost the same, but just a few small changes here and there. But you must be aware of that. Let me give you an example. P are children who have cough and fever and we're worried about influenza. That's the subgroup of patients. Second, the index test. Here the index test is influenza test. R is a reference standard. What is the gold standard for this particular disease? And T is a target condition, which is influenza, which will be positive or negative. This is a particular methodology. Instead of PICO, one talks about PIRT. Now I'll come back to this particular stages of development of a diagnostic study. So we started off with the birth of a new test, which is a bright idea, usually in laboratory. And let us take D-dimer test as an example. D-dimer is a test to diagnose blood clots, deep vein thrombosis. First, we want to ask the question, will the D-dimer diagnose people with disease, and will it be negative in people without proven disease? That is the case control. So this technical phase or the initial phase is usually not reflective of real life. The reason I'm mentioning this in particular is many diagnostic studies are case control studies. You take people with proven disease and then you compare it with people without disease. This artificially inflates the diagnostic accuracy of the test. In real life, what happens? Patients with suspected disease are taken and they are given the two tests, the new test versus the old test. That is a diagnostic randomized control study. So we need to be very aware that the technical phase of a test often involves case control studies or taking people with known disease and looking at the way the test performs in them. Whereas in a real world, people just come as people. We don't know what diagnosis they have. And your new test has to be done on all of them. And the reference standard needs to be done on all of them. So with all this information, does the patient actually have disease? Now we'll talk about likelihood ratios and post-test probabilities a little later. So some people do, because we have a lot of information, to multivariate analysis. And they want to know, based on all the data we have so far, can we make some sort of a clinical decision rule? So in this last part here, at the end of it all, you want to ask yourself, if I introduce this new test, will my patients benefit? And that is this last part here. So that is actually answered by a randomized control study. So just remember that the ultimate diagnostic study is to randomize patients into two arms. One group gets your test, one group gets another test, and based on that, they are treated. And then you can make out is the patient getting better or not. So important aspects in a diagnostic study. Diagnostic studies two important words, PR and CR. PR stands for prospective recruitment. CR stands for consecutive recruitment. And the good reference standard must be clearly described. The new test or the index test must be clearly described. And the people who know the reference of the index test should be blinded to the results of the gold standard test and vice versa. Now, some people have one index test and one reference standard. I'll explain that in a minute. Some people take two index tests and one or more reference standards. That's a bit confusing, try to do a study like that. I just wanted to put these two methodologies out before you. All right. So the next series of slides which I'm going to take to you are going to be a little bit more in depth. So you are all statisticians and people will come to you and tell, please teach us to design a diagnostic study. Please do sample size calculation for diagnostic study. Check and see if our protocol is correct or methodology is correct. The last part of my whole talk, the next 40 minutes, I'm going to focus on this detailed aspect. And this is the part which I think the part which I've covered so far, most of you may already know and may be thinking, oh, I know this stuff. But this next part which I'm going to take, I put a lot of effort because I know that this is exactly what you need to be teaching students who come to you. So I've tried to keep it so that it'll be useful for you to teach other people. I've given the reference for this particular slide where I've taken these from, and I think that you will find them useful. There are 6 questions which one must think about when you're planning a diagnostic study. First is the direction of data collection, prospective or retrospective, the number of gates which the study can have, participant sampling, consecutive, random, or neither. The method of allocation to the index test, is it a random allocation, non-random allocation? How many gold standard or reference standard tests you have, single or multiple? Is there limited verification in the design, or does everybody get the gold standard test? So these are the 6 questions which one must answer in a diagnostic study. Now, the first one is the direction of data collection and the number of gates. Now, this slide may look confusing to you, but I'm going to take you through that a bit slowly. The first is the fully paired design. And I would like all of you to look at this carefully. You have patients who come into the study. Test A is the index test. Test B is the another index test, and RS stands for the reference standard. So in this particular method, everybody gets one index test, everybody gets another index test, and everybody gets a reference standard. So this is called a fully paired study design. And this is the ideal study where you can compare 2 index tests with a reference standard. Everybody gets everything. So it's a fantastic study design. The next is called partially paired with random subset. Here you have a group of patients. Everybody has test A. So far very similar to the one above. Then everybody is randomized. Some people get test B. Some people are randomized directly to get the reference standard. Only those randomized to test B, after they have test B, they have reference standard. This is called partially paired. The next is called partially paired with non-random subset. Here you have the same group of patients. Everybody gets test A. So far, all 3 are the same. The difference between these two here is that here it is randomly divided into some getting test B, and then they get the reference standard. Other people just go on to reference standard. Here, the difference, it is non-random. By non-random choice, some people get test B and a reference standard. Some people only have a reference standard. Unpaired randomized study design. Here, you have a group of patients. They're randomized to get index test A or index test B randomly. Whoever gets test A gets the reference standard. Whoever gets test B gets the reference standard. So this is called unpaired randomized diagnostic studies. Then there are unpaired non-randomized diagnostic studies. So you still start off with a group of patients. They are not randomized by a non-random method. Some people do test A and have a reference standard. Some people have test B and have a reference standard. So these are the different methods by which randomized control studies can be done if you have one or more index tests. Direction of data collection. Whether data was collected prior to the study initiation or you made a protocol and then started collecting data. So when you say prospective, it means prospectively enrolling the study participants, prospectively performing the test, and prospectively interpreting the test. That is what is called prospective. Everything else is called retrospective. Now, why is this so important? The knowledge of the, if you already got the data with you, then the data may not be reliable or valid. And if you want to make a study flow diagram, reconstructing the study flow diagram will be very difficult. If you purposefully collect data prospectively after ethical clearance, the quality of the data is likely to be much higher and have a much higher validity. Now, gates. Now, whether a single set or a multiple sets of eligibility criteria is available. Single gate means all participants have to have a certain criteria by which they are recruited into the study. All suspected people with COVID are included in the study. That's called a single gate. Multiple gate or two gate is people who are already COVID positive by a particular test, they are called cases. People who are already known to be negative are called controls. These are called separate gates. These are not very ideal. If you have separate gates, people are already confirmed with what we call disease, already not confirmed, they call non-disease, it will inflate the diagnostic test accuracy. Now sampling. Remember I told you a slide where there's a whole universe of people with disease. How do you choose from that? Random sampling is you take a random number of people from the whole group. Consecutive sampling is you take the first 100 people from that group. Neither consecutive nor random is you just choose whoever's close by to you, whoever comes to the hospital. This is called convenience sampling. There's nothing wrong. May not be as good or representative if you do a population-based sampling. But how do you get all those people to your center? It's time consuming and expensive. So people have done this non-consecutive sampling. Now you have got a sample collected. You have two index tests. How do you decide which patient goes to index test A and some people go to index test B? That could be a random method or it could be a non-random method. And that I've explained to you in the slide prior to this. So the method of allocating a participant to index test A or B is also important. Now, from what I've explained so far, you may also be thinking there must be only one gold standard. But some studies, they have two gold standards. Now, how can one study have two gold standards? Let us say that the study is done in CMC Vellore and maybe another hospital. Our gold standard for tuberculosis in CMC Vellore may be Lowenstein Jensen culture. Whereas in another hospital, the gold standard may be a PCR test. So you see, it is possible if one is doing a multi-center study that there may be different centers having different gold standards. This is not ideal. It is ideal for all centers to have the same gold standard. because each gold standard may vary slightly from place to place, how it is done, technical expertise, and stuff like that. So this is why we must specify the number of reference standards. Now, limited verification. Now, looking at my study flow diagram, one will often assume that everybody who has test A must have the gold standard at a minimum. Now, sometimes the gold standard is very costly. This is the gold standard is a biopsy and surgery. So they're trying to find out ways to cut costs. So they may say, but only those who are positive by the gold standard test will also have a small percentage of them will have the gold standard test. So let me give an example. You do a test for COVID by antibody. It costs 10 rupees, but the PCR test costs 1000 rupees. So you do the test on 1000 suspected people, the antibody test. Let us say only 20 or 30 are positive by that. Only those 20 or 30 will have the gold standard test. Among the 900 who are negative by the antibody test, you take a random sampling and do the gold standard test. Now, this is called limited verification. Now, limited verification is sometimes done to save costs. So just because limited verification is done, it doesn't make it too bad, but it reduces the validity of the study. Now, these 6 questions which I asked, are people talking about each of these? Yes, they are. So this is a particular randomized meta-analysis of various diagnostic studies under the 6 headings: direction, number of gates, sampling, allocation to index tests, number of reference standards, and limited verification. This was published by Yang and colleagues in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology, and they found among 100 diagnostic studies, 42% were retrospective, which is not good. 73% had a single gate, which is good. 62% we could not make out how did they sample patients from the general population. And in 72% there was a single reference standard, meaning in about 30% maybe there were 2 reference standards available. And 93% had no limited verification. That means 7% of studies had limited verification. So these are shown in a study way: data collection, number of gates, sampling, allocation method, reference standard, and limited verification. So most of the studies were prospective as compared to retrospective. Most of the studies had single gate as compared to multiple gates. Most of the sampling, only few are clear consecutive sampling. Most studies, it was unclear what the sampling methodology was. Allocation concealment or allocation method was in the fully paired, it was reasonably done, but many studies it was unclear. Reference standard was a single reference standard in many studies, but it was multiple in a few studies. Some studies it was not clear. Limited verification, no. In fact, it seems to be only a small minority of studies. Okay, so I hope this particular visual summary is clear for you all. Now I'll just want to go to a slightly little bit more detailed methodology. This I want to talk about the fully paired design, and I'm going to go to a few slides before to talk about that again. I think it's important because many people are now trying to do this fully paired design. I think I missed the slide. This one, the fully paired design. In the fully paired design, all patients have test A, all patients have test B, and all patients have the reference standard. So how do you present the results in a fully paired design? Sorry, I'm going a bit back and forth, but I thought it's important for you to know. This is the fully paired design, and I'll give you the reference in the next slide. This is a study published by Agarastos and colleagues. It is comparing the accuracy of the HPV test with liquid-based cytology. This is for cancer of the cervix. And the gold standard is a biopsy which was done up subsequently. So everybody had the HPV test, everybody had the liquid cytology test, and everybody had a colposcopic with biopsy. So you can see this is the fully paired design. So we can see here that the reference standard, that is a colposcopy positive, colposcopy negative. I'm putting up this table just to show you how results are published when you do a fully paired design. This is called 2x4 table data. So this is the colposcopy positive, colposcopy negative, HPV positive, HPV negative. So LBC is a liquid-based cytology, LBC positive, LBC negative. So this is among those reference standard positive, and this is among those reference standard negative. So within one larger reference standard, you can do two tests and present all the results in one single test table. This is called 2x4 table data. Now the points to remember that this table includes only 454 of all the 4,000. 13 were excluded because they didn't have LBC data. 3 were excluded because they didn't have HPV data. 150 did not receive the colposcopy or the gold standard. 3,000 were negative in the HPV, LBC, and were not included. So there are some caveats to go into this. Today, we don't have to understand all about 2x4 table data, but you can go into this 2x4 if you're interested in publishing these types. Now, test as part of a clinical pathway. Now, just remember that we do a test. The test itself may have harm. For example, you do a biopsy. The biopsy may lead to complications, and the patient may suffer because you did the test. Just by doing a pap smear on somebody, the patient may get stressed out, oh, maybe I've got cancer. So tests by themselves can cause harm. So that's an important concept to keep in your mind. Second, the test will give you some information. The test will be positive or the test will be negative. Based on that, a decision is made to treat the patient or to not treat the patient, and an action will follow. You may give the patient the medicine, or you may decide not to give medicine. The patient, on listening to your history and physical and all his story, may decide to take the treatment or decide not to take the treatment. Based on that decision to take the treatment or not take the treatment, he may get better, he may not get better. So your test, in fact, has a long, complicated clinical pathway to rethink the patient getting better or not. Remember, not getting better may also include the harms of the diagnostic test. So all these are the clinical pathway in which a diagnostic test lives. Now, you may think from what I have described, all these are very clearly defined in all studies. People publish all these things very clearly. Now, this is a nice publication, which is fairly recent, 2019, and they looked at how people publish diagnostic studies. And what they found was, I didn't give the results of the study, and I'll tell you in words that very few people publish diagnostic studies with all the data clearly. How did they get the PICO question? What kind of study design? Very few people talk about the number of gates and how did they have a study flow diagram? How was the gold standard done? Was there complete verification or partial verification? All these are not usually described very well in most diagnostic studies. So the reporting of diagnostic studies is often poor. People, I think, actually do good diagnostic studies, but they report them very poorly. So I'll summarize with this. Diagnostic studies are useful in many situations. they are ideally done prospectively and consecutively. In other words, you must plan the study and do it prospectively. And you must take consecutive patients and not patients whoever you feel like. You should not do diagnostic studies ideally in people with already proven disease. That is a case control study. It must be a prospective cohort study. The new test is also called the index test, and that must be clearly defined. The reference test or the gold standard test must be a good test, preferably one single gold standard test for the entire study, and it must be valid and people must believe that. We can compare two tests at the same time against one gold standard, what we just talked about. There are many different technical words for every aspect of a diagnostic study. So people often get confused. They report it in different ways. So if you're reading a diagnostic study, it's often confusing to know what people are talking about. If I didn't put up the slide, if anybody's interested in critically appraising a diagnostic study, there are two technical documents available. Maybe in retrospect, I could have put up. One is called STAR-D, STARD, STAR-D. This is standards for reporting diagnostic studies. So you may think, why should I read the STAR-D document? STAR-D, it's only useful after you have reported the study. No, it is very useful while planning a diagnostic study. So I would urge all of you to look at that particular document. You can just Google it, STAR-D, STARD. The second one is called QUADAS, QUADAS, QUADAS. QUADAS is a mnemonic again for how a diagnostic study should be published. But a good idea would be at this stage to read those two guidelines before you start getting into planning a study. So I have tried to cover a lot of material at this time. I speak a bit fast, and I'm not sure if my language is clear or understandable. I had the mask on initially. I apologize because there was somebody else in the same room as me. So I've left myself with 15 minutes for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions which any of you may have. And if I can't answer those questions, I'll look up the answers and I'll answer them tomorrow when I meet you again for the session on reliability and then validity. So once again, I'll stop now and take questions. You can ask the questions in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask me questions.
There is a question in the chat from Mohan Das Muriation.
Yes. So for fully paired study, whether it is possible to use single index test twice instead of two index tests. I'll answer that by going back to this. Now the fully paired design, it is meant for two separate index tests. It is not doing the same index test at two different time points. It is two separate tests. Now you may say, I want to do a PCR by method A and a PCR by method B. Then you can call them two separate tests, I suppose. But it's not really meant for doing the two identical tests at two different time points. So that's my understanding of a fully paired test. And it is then published, reported in this particular methodology like this. So you put the reference standard positive, reference standard negative, and you have the two tests, the two index tests are put here in both columns. A diagnostic study can be cross-sectional. Yes, it can be cross-sectional. You have a group of people at one point of time. Some people have disease, some people don't have disease. You find out that by doing the gold standard test on everybody and the index test on everybody. But the problem with doing that particular methodology is you may not have everybody with suspected disease at that point of time, doing it at one point of time. So that is the problem with doing a cross-sectional study design. It is possible, but you must have enough number of people with suspected disease at that point of time. Sir,
one comment about this, the cross-sectional study design.
Yes.
If the disease prevalence is lower, so 5% or 10%, then I'm not sure whether the cross-sectional study is feasible to do, because eventually we'll end up with a lot of numbers to be studied. And all subjects have to go through both the tests.
I agree with sir. So it's usually people like to do it as a prospective study rather than a cross-sectional study. If you have if a highly prevalent disease, then you can do as sir explained. The next question is, sir, please explain what to do when the gold standard is imperfect. Now, that's a very good question. Imperfect gold standard. Now, Now, this is the particular problem when the gold standard is imperfect. Now, there are two ways of answering the question. One method is to estimate how wrong your gold standard is likely to be. So there are some ways of estimating how imperfect your gold standard is likely to be. And you can do some sort of correction for that in your estimate of sensitivity and specificity. So that is one particular method of doing that. You can say my gold standard is likely to be so wrong, and therefore you can do this. The second method, which is a little bit more advanced than what this workshop can cover, is called latent class modeling, latent class method, where you take all the tests possible and the latent class will generate a possible, it's called a computerized method, where it generates a gold standard of its own against which all the tests are compared. That is called latent class method. So imperfect gold standard. Now, it's a good question because many people now say, please don't use the word gold standard because there is no perfect test. So now instead of the word gold standard, people have started using the word reference standard. So even a reference standard is often not perfect. And for example, tuberculosis, the Lowenstein-Jensen culture method was called gold standard. Now it is largely replaced by the PCR test, which people say is better than the culture method. And some people say even both of these are not good. You must take a composite standard, which is clinical, radiological, plus culture or PCR, all put together, including a response to treatment or composite gold standard. So one of the ways of getting over imperfect gold standard is to develop a better gold standard, which is a composite of clinical, radiological, as well as laboratory. The second method is to sort of do some sort of statistical adjustment for it. The third method is the latent class method, and it is beyond me to take the class on it. Dr. J. Seelan is the expert on latent class methods.
Excuse me, sir. As you have mentioned about the latent class modeling,
yes.
Shall we? Is it having any? Can we use it in clinical situations, or it is for the study purpose only? This latent class modeling.
You have collected,
can we use it in the clinical situation?
Good question. No, it's not used in day-to-day clinical practice every day. You have data collected. You have 2 or 3 tests, and none of them is a gold standard or a good gold standard. You give the data to statistician, then they will do the latent class analysis, and then they'll tell you each of your index tests, what is the sensitivity and specificity against the latent class gold standard, which is sort of inherent within the test. So then you can say, okay, my new test has got this much sensitivity and specificity. So it's not used in day-to-day clinical practice. Okay, sir, kindly describe situations
Thanks.
where inflation of sensitivity and specificity may happen. Okay, now it's very simple. You take cases with proven cancer and you take patients who are healthy, people walking about on the road, and you try out your new test. In this situation, the new test will look very good because everybody has clearly defined disease, and the people without disease or the controls or the disease negative are clearly without disease. So this is an example where the test characteristics get inflated. That is the positive predictive value. The negative predictive value will get inflated. So if you do a case control study design, those indices of the test, which we'll talk about later, positive and negative predictive value get inflated. Sensitivity and specificity will vary. If I take a cohort of people with severe disease, let us say I take people with severe or stage 4 cancer, and I do my test, my sensitivity and specificity will be very high. Suppose you are in another clinical situation, people with early stage cancer, then the sensitivity and specificity in that situation will vary. So sensitivity and specificity are little dependent on the severity of disease which is done in that particular area. The positive and negative predictive value of a test vary dependent on the prevalence of disease in that particular area. So that's an important concept to keep in mind. Can recruiting patients consecutively be considered as a sampling technique? So prospective recruitment is when you have an IRB protocol or an ethics committee protocol, then you start data collection. That's the first part of data collection. The sampling method is if you have a large number of patients available at the beginning, then you can randomly select from them. If you don't have all the patients available in the beginning, that's why Dr. Jason said, if the prevalence is low, then you can't do a random selection because there are very few people in the beginning to start off with. Then you must do the consecutive selection of patients where every patient who fulfills the inclusion criteria, he must be consecutively recruited. So it must be prospective as well as consecutive. If you do consecutive recruitment, then the patients reflect the real population of that area. All the people coming to that particular clinic or hospital or the community center, they reflect the general population. So that's why it's very important to do consecutive recruitment and not saying that I'll take people today, then the next 1 week I'm on leave for puja holiday, then I'll come back, then I'll recruit some people. So that is the real reason why we must do consecutive recruitment. So your question was, can recruiting patients consecutively be considered a sampling technique? It's part of the sampling technique, yes. Sir, should the population of the diagnostic study always be those with suspected disease to identify those with disease and without disease also? So I'll try to answer that in using another one of my slides, and I should actually acknowledge that this slide is not my own. This slide is taken from the Cochrane organization, which I also represent. They have some diagnostic systematic reviews, and this slide is taken from that. When somebody develops a test newly, they don't know whether the test will work at all. They don't want to try it out on real patients. So they'll go to a doctor and say, doctor, give me somebody whom you have already confirmed disease, and I want to see if my test works on them. Suppose my new test doesn't work on people with confirmed disease, then it's a useless test. So those are the cases. Then if it works on them, they'll say, okay, doctor, give me some people whom you know who don't have this particular disease, and I want to try out my test. Those are the controls. Suppose those controls are identified as having disease by the new test, and you say, oh, this is a false positive. So that situation where you have people with confirmed disease, you try a new test. People without disease, you try a new test. That's called case control. And you'll find sadly that many publications have new diagnostic test, which is a case control study. And then they'll tell people, now you must start using this new test. That is the problem. It's not that you should not do case control studies, identify people with disease, identify people without disease, and then try a new test. No, there's a technical phase of a diagnostic studies career. In the career of a diagnostic test, that is still a technical phase. That does not reflect real life. You will have artificially inflated positive predictive value and negative predictive values. Then you must do the next stage of the diagnostic test. Sit in a clinic. Everybody who's suspected of having disease, you try your new test. Also, everybody must have the gold standard test. Then you will find the reality of the test. How does the test work in real life? So that's why it's not that you can't do case control study. If you do a case control study, you must be aware that it doesn't reflect reality. I hope I answered your question. Okay, I have not talked about reliability, validity, and those things. Those are for tomorrow, and then the subsequent week after that, we'll do. Tomorrow will be reliability, then validity, and then ROC curves.
Thanks, Sambu. It looks like no further questions. Shall we stop here?
Sure, sir. I'm happy.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All
This
right.
is a very good presentation. Good slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to the audience for patiently listening at this evening hour. I wish you all a safe and happy evening, and see you all tomorrow at the same time. Thank you to Melvin and team for organizing as well. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.